Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Carl Bridgewater case, a story that began on a quiet Tuesday in late summer. It was the 19th of September, 1978, in the village of Wordsley. The air was beginning to hold that subtle, crisp edge of autumn, though the sun still cast long, golden fingers across the brickwork of the terraced houses and the sprawling green fields of the West Midlands. Imagine the sound of a distant lawnmower, the faint chatter of neighbors over garden fences, and the soft, rhythmic whirring of bicycle tires on smooth asphalt. This was a place of routine and safety, where the arrival of the evening newspaper was a marker of the day's gentle close. Carl was a boy of 13, known for his energy and his wide, easy smile. He was small for his age, earned the nickname the Atom by those who knew him, a testament to the way he seemed to move through life with a constant, humming vitality. On this particular afternoon, the light was fading slowly, turning the sky into a soft canvas of lavender and pale gray, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the gathering twilight. Carl's day had been slightly different from his usual schedule. He had spent a portion of his afternoon at the dentist, a mundane errand that had caused him to start his paper route a little later than he typically would. By the time he reached the newsagent's shop on Wordsley High Street, the stack of newspapers was waiting for him, the ink fresh and the paper crisp. He loaded them into his bag, feeling the familiar weight settle against his shoulder, a heavy, comforting burden that spoke of responsibility and a few pounds of hard-earned pocket money at the end of the week. His bicycle, a sturdy machine with a frame the color of a summer sky, stood leaning against the brick wall. He gripped the handlebars, the rubber cool against his palms, and began his journey. The blue bicycle was his pride, a flash of sapphire as he wove through the streets. The clicking of the gear hub was a steady companion as he moved past the familiar houses of Lawnswood Drive, delivering news of the world to people who were settling in for their evening tea, unaware that the quiet of their village was about to be shattered by an unthinkable act of violence. As Carl moved further away from the heart of the village, the houses began to thin, replaced by high hedgerows and the deep, tangled shadows of the Staffordshire countryside. The road stretched out toward the A449, a long and lonely ribbon of tarmac that led toward Yew Tree Farm. The farm sat in a pocket of isolation, a rambling and ancient structure of weathered stone and dark timber that seemed to watch the road with a hollow, silent gaze. To reach it, Carl had to navigate a long, winding driveway, where the trees arched overhead like the ribs of a great, forgotten cathedral. The sound of the wind through the leaves was a soft, sibilant whisper, and the only other noise was the crunch of gravel beneath his tires. It was roughly 4:20 in the afternoon when he reached the final stretch. The world felt still here, as if the farm existed in a bubble of time where the modern world of 1978 could not quite reach. The scent of damp earth and old hay was thick in the air, a heavy, earthy perfume that clung to his skin as he pedaled closer to the looming farmhouse. Yew Tree Farm was home to two elderly cousins, Mary Poole and Fred Jones. They were gentle people, struggling with the infirmities of age, and they had a standing arrangement with their young paperboy. Because Mary found it difficult to walk all the way to the gate, Carl had been given a special instruction. He was to enter the rear porch and place the newspaper on a wooden chair just inside the door. It was a small act of kindness, a few extra steps that Carl took without a second thought. On this Tuesday, however, the farm felt unusually quiet. There were no voices from the kitchen, no sound of a radio drifting through an open window. The cousins were away for the day, a rare occurrence that left the sprawling house vulnerable and silent. As Carl leaned his blue bicycle against the side of the building, the metal gave a faint, lonely clink. The farmhouse stood tall and gray against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the pale light like sightless eyes. He walked toward the porch, his footsteps light on the stones, clutching the folded newspaper in his hand, moving into a silence that felt far too heavy for the time of day. The heavy wooden door of the porch was already ajar, a small detail that might have seemed unremarkable in a village where doors were often left unlocked. But as Carl stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The air inside the farmhouse was cool and still, smelling of floor wax and old, dusty curtains. There was a tension in the silence, a heavy, vibrating quality that made the hair on his arms stand up. He moved toward the living room, perhaps intending to leave the paper in a more secure spot, or perhaps drawn by a sound he could not quite identify. The floorboards beneath the carpet groaned softly under his weight. In that moment, the peace of the afternoon vanished. The discovery that followed was one of profound and sudden tragedy. When the farm was later entered by a neighbor, Dr. Angus MacDonald, the scene revealed the terrible reality of what had transpired in that quiet parlor. Carl had not merely stumbled upon a robbery. He had walked into the path of something far more dark and final. The silence of Yew Tree Farm had become permanent, a heavy shroud that would fall over the village of Wordsley for decades to come, leaving a void where a young boy's laughter used to be. The evening deepened, and at the Bridgewater home, the table was set for dinner. Carl's mother, Janet, waited for the sound of the back door opening, for the familiar clatter of the blue bicycle being leaned against the wall. But the minutes stretched into hours, and the food grew cold. By 5:40, the concern in the house had turned into a cold, gnawing dread. Carl's father, Brian, set out with his daughter to retrace the paper route, their eyes searching the shadows of every lane and cul-de-sac. They eventually found themselves drawn toward the blue lights and the gathering crowd at the end of the long driveway to Yew Tree Farm. There, the blue bicycle was found, cast aside like a broken toy, its frame catching the flickering light of the police lanterns. The vibrant life of a 13-year-old boy had been extinguished in a place of supposed safety, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the landscape. The bicycle stood as a lonely monument to a journey that was never completed, and a silence that even the passing of many years could never quite fill. Tonight, we remember Carl, and we begin our journey into the long search for the truth. The afternoon sun of September 19th, 1978, was beginning to dip behind the heavy, ancient oaks that guarded Yew Tree Farm. It was a day that should have ended with the simple sounds of the countryside, the distant lowing of cattle, and the rustle of wind through the drying corn. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence had settled over the isolated farmhouse. When Dr. Angus MacDonald, a family friend of the farm's elderly residents, pulled his car into the gravel driveway, he noticed the stillness immediately. It was a silence that felt thick, almost tactile. Usually the farm was a place of slow, predictable movement, but today everything seemed frozen in time. He stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots, a sound that felt jarringly abrasive in the quiet air. He walked toward the front door and saw it was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out from the interior. A faint, metallic scent lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of damp stone and old wood. He pushed the door open, the hinges giving a long, mournful groan that echoed into the hallway. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of furniture polish and dust motes dancing in the dying light. As he moved toward the living room, he saw the boy. Carl was lying on the settee, looking almost as if he had simply sat down to rest, but the stillness was absolute. The horror of the scene was framed by the mundane surroundings of a quiet country home, the ticking of a grandfather clock, the only heartbeat left in the room. Soon, the rural peace was shattered by the arrival of the Staffordshire police. Blue lights began to pulse against the weathered brickwork of the farm, casting long, rhythmic shadows that stretched across the fields like grasping fingers. Detective Chief Superintendent Bob Stewart arrived to find a scene that defied the quiet logic of the area. The investigators moved through the house with a hushed, reverent intensity. They found Carl's bicycle discarded outside, its metal frame cold to the touch, a silent witness to the moment he had stepped off it for the last time. Inside the house, the air was heavy with the acrid, lingering ghost of gunpowder. The officers noted the disarray of the rooms, the sense that someone had been hunting for something valuable, something hidden within the walls of this old sanctuary. They looked for fingerprints on the polished surfaces, their brushes whispering against the wood, but the intruders had been careful. The motive seemed clear enough at first glance, a burglary interrupted by a boy who was simply doing his job. Antiques, the treasures of the elderly cousins who lived there, were missing. But the violence used against a 13-year-old paperboy was a jagged, inexplicable piece of the puzzle. It was a crime that felt too large and too cruel for such a small, forgotten corner of the world. As the news of the murder rippled through the nearby village of Stourbridge, a cloud of unease settled over every household. The police were under immense, crushing pressure to provide answers to a community that suddenly felt vulnerable. Every stranger in a car, every unusual sound at night, became a source of suspicion. The investigators focused their energy on a few key sightings reported by witnesses in the area. Several people mentioned seeing a blue Vauxhall Viva near the farm that afternoon, driven by a man in a dark blue uniform. This detail led them to interview a local ambulance driver named Hubert Spencer, who not only owned such a car, but had permission to shoot on the farm's grounds. Spencer was a man who knew the rhythms of Yew Tree Farm well, and for a time, the spotlight of the investigation burned brightly upon him. Yet, despite the coincidences, the police found themselves looking elsewhere. The demand for a swift resolution was a deafening roar in the ears of the Staffordshire force. They needed more than just a local man with a car. They needed a gang, a definitive group that could explain the calculated nature of the robbery. The papers were filled with the image of Carl, a bright-eyed boy whose life had been snuffed out for the sake of a few trinkets, and the public's grief was rapidly turning into a demand for retribution. The focus of the investigation began to pivot toward a different group of men, a shift that would eventually lead to one of the most controversial chapters in British legal history. 2 months after the tragedy at Yew Tree Farm, an armed robbery occurred at Chapel Farm, another isolated property not far away. The similarities were enough to ignite a new fire in the detectives' minds. They arrested Vincent Hickey, a man with a history of petty crime who had been driving a stolen car. In the cold, gray confines of the interrogation room, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the hum of fluorescent lights, the pressure was applied. Vincent, seeking a way to protect himself, began to speak. He pointed the finger at his cousin, Michael Hickey, and another associate, James Robinson. The police now had names, and the narrative they had been searching for began to take shape. They pictured 4 men, a desperate gang looking for easy pickings in the quiet countryside, who had been surprised by a young boy and chose a path of ultimate cruelty. The final piece of their puzzle was Patrick Molly, an older man who struggled with alcohol and was easily swayed. Under the intense, unrelenting questioning of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, the boundaries between truth and suggestion began to blur. Inside the police station, the walls seemed to close in on Patrick Molly. He was told that the others had already confessed, that his only hope was to tell the story the police wanted to hear. Exhausted and broken, he eventually signed a confession, a document that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He claimed he had been upstairs, searching for valuables, when he heard the fatal shot from the living room below. This statement linked all 4 men to the scene, providing the coherent story the public and the authorities craved. These 4 individuals, who would soon be known to the world as the Bridgewater Four, were cast as the villains in a tragedy that had no other suspects left in the frame. The fingerprints on Carl's bicycle did not match any of them, and no physical evidence placed them inside the farmhouse, but the weight of the confession was a heavy shroud that covered all doubts. The Staffordshire police felt the relief of a case seemingly closed, a community supposedly safe once more. But beneath the surface of this resolution, the shadows at Yew Tree Farm remained. The silence of the house had been replaced by the noise of a trial, yet the truth seemed to be slipping further away into the mist, hidden behind the high walls of a conviction built on a foundation of sand. The air inside Wombourne Police Station was stale, a thick, suffocating soup of cold tobacco smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed fear. For Patrick Mall, the passage of time had dissolved into a blurred sequence of gray walls and the relentless, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to mock his exhaustion. He had been in this room, or rooms exactly like it, for over 30 hours. The detectives, their faces etched with a grim, practiced determination, leaned across the scarred wooden table, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the peeling wallpaper. Every time Patrick tried to close his eyes, a hand would rap sharply on the table, or a voice would bark another question, pulling him back into the flickering, harsh light of the interrogation. They had asked him the same things over and over. 80 times he had told them he was not there. 80 times he had denied the blood and the violence of that September afternoon at Yew Tree Farm. But the walls of the cell were not just made of brick and mortar. They were built from the weight of his own history, his past mistakes, and the growing, suffocating sense that no one in this building was truly listening to him. The investigators did not seem to want his innocence. They wanted a shape that fit the hole in their investigation, a narrative that would finally quiet the public outcry and provide an ending to a tragedy that had haunted the West Midlands for months. In the quietest hour of the night, when the rest of the world was draped in the soft velvet of sleep, the trap was finally set. A detective, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper, slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a statement, or so they told him, from Vincent Hickey. Patrick's eyes, red-rimmed and heavy with the leaden weight of 31 hours of sleep deprivation, struggled to focus on the handwritten lines. He saw names, he saw the farm, and he saw his own life being traded away by a man he thought was his comrade. This was the masterstroke of the Regional Crime Squad, a carefully contrived device of deceit. They told him that Vincent had already spilled everything, that the others were pointing the finger directly at him, and that if he did not help himself now, he would be the one to face the full, terrible weight of the law alone. They whispered that only guilty men need time to think, and that an innocent man would have nothing to hide. Under this immense, crushing pressure, the line between memory and imagination began to fray like an old rope. He was told what to say, the words being offered to him like a lifeline that was actually a noose. Eventually, the pen felt like a mountain in his hand as he signed the document that would become known to history as Exhibit 54. It was a confession born not of guilt, but of a soul that had been hollowed out by the sheer, relentless force of psychological attrition. While Patrick Malley was breaking in the shadows of Wombourne, the other 3 men, James Robinson, Michael Hickey, and Vincent Hickey, were being held in their own silos of isolation. James Robinson, a man who knew the rough, unforgiving edges of the world, met the accusations with a fierce, jagged defiance. He was a man of the streets, used to the pressure of the law, but even he could feel the temperature rising in the room. Michael Hickey, only 17 years old, was a boy caught in a man's nightmare. He was subjected to days of rigorous questioning, his young mind pushed to the absolute brink as the officers tried to weave him into the tapestry of the crime. Vincent, whose own desperate attempts to bargain for immunity had inadvertently lit the fuse on this powder keg, watched in horror as his words were twisted and turned against him. They were men with criminal records. Yes, men who had lived on the fringes of society and had taken part in other robberies. But they maintained, with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity, that they had nothing to do with the death of the 13-year-old Paperboy. There was no forensic evidence to bind them to the farmhouse. There was no blood on their clothes, no fingerprints on the door frames, and no trace of their presence in the dust of the living room where Carl had met his end. The investigation was a house of cards, held together by the thin, adhesive tape of a disputed confession and the silence of a missing weapon. The autumn of 1979 brought the four men to Stafford Crown Court. The building was an imposing monument of law, its oak-paneled walls and high, vaulted ceilings designed to inspire awe and a sense of inescapable gravity. Inside the courtroom, the air felt ancient, smelling of floor wax and the heavy wool of legal robes. The public gallery was packed to the rafters, a sea of faces fueled by a year of sensational headlines and a collective, burning need for justice. Sir Maurice Drake, the judge, sat high above the proceedings, a figure of silent, stony authority. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the foundation of Patrick Molley's statement. They painted a vivid, dark picture of a robbery gone wrong, of four desperate men who had stumbled upon a boy and chosen a cold, final silence over the risk of being caught. They spoke of a blue car and a van, of a sawn-off shotgun purchased for £20, and of a shared guilt that bound the defendants together. But as the days turned into weeks, a haunting silence hung over the forensic evidence. The defense pointed out that the fingerprints found on Carl's orange bicycle, the bike that had been tossed into a pigsty like a discarded toy, did not match any of the four men in the dock. The forensic record was a blank page, a void where there should have been a trail of breadcrumbs. Yet, the jury was told that the confession was the cement, the vital substance that filled the cracks and made the fragments of circumstantial evidence a solid, undeniable whole. The pressure in the room was a physical thing, a tightening in the chest of every person present. A 19-year-old juror would later speak of a gut feeling that the men were innocent, of a nagging doubt that whispered in the back of her mind, but the weight of the tragedy was too immense to ignore. The nation was crying out for a resolution to the murder of the atom, the small boy with the boundless energy who had vanished into the shadows of Yew Tree Farm. When the jury finally returned, the silence in the court was so profound that the rustle of a gown felt like a thunderclap. The verdicts fell like heavy stones into a dark pool. James Robinson, Vincent Hickey, and the 17-year-old Michael Hickey were found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison, with recommendations that they serve at least 25 years. Patrick Molley, the man whose broken spirit had provided the key to the cell doors, was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years. As they were led away to the subterranean world of the prison system, the echoes of their denials rang out against the cold stone. Michael's mother, Anne Wellen, stood in the gallery and shouted a promise to her son, a promise that she would fight for him until the truth was finally dragged into the light. But for now, the heavy iron doors slammed shut, and the four men were swallowed by a system that had traded the messy, complicated truth for the neat, satisfying conclusion of a conviction. The iron-heavy doors of the British penal system did not just lock Michael Hickey away from the world. They attempted to lock him away from his own name. In the eyes of the state, and in the eyes of a public still reeling from the brutality of the crime, he was no longer a young man from the West Midlands. He was a label. He was one of the four. For the first few years of his sentence, the walls of the cell were not just made of stone and mortar. They were built from the crushing weight of a verdict that felt like a burial. The air inside the prison was thick, with the scent of floor wax, industrial bleach, and the stale, lingering aroma of overcooked cabbage that seemed to seep out of the very bricks. Every morning, the wake-up call was a rhythmic clatter of keys against metal bars, a sound that vibrated through the marrow of his bones. But while the system expected him to wither under the shame of a crime he did not commit, something else was simmering beneath the surface. It was a cold, hard clarity. If the courts would not listen to the truth spoken in a whisper, he would have to find a way to scream it from the highest point he could reach. The night of November 24th, 1983, was draped in a thick, damp fog that clung to the watchtowers of Gartree Prison in Leicestershire. The ground was slick with the first breaths of a coming winter. Michael moved with a desperate, quiet focus, his fingers numbing as they found purchase on the rough textures of the building's exterior. He climbed, not toward freedom, but toward exposure. When he finally reached the expansive, sloping roof, the wind hit him with a sudden, violent force. It was a sharp, biting wind that felt as though it had traveled across the vast, frozen plains of the east just to find him there, perched on the edge of the world. He unfurled a banner he had painstakingly crafted in the shadows of his cell. In bold, jagged letters, it bore a name and a plea. "Spencer killed Carl," it read. "We are innocent." As the sun began to crawl over the horizon, painting the gray slate in hues of bruised purple and pale gold, the guards below looked up to see a solitary figure silhouetted against the sky. The rooftop vigil had begun, and no one could have predicted that it would last for 89 grueling days. Days bled into weeks, and the roof became a landscape of endurance. To stay on those slates was to engage in a slow war with the elements. Michael's world narrowed down to the tilt of the roof and the direction of the wind. When the rain came, it was a relentless, freezing gray curtain that soaked through his layers, turning his clothes into a heavy, frigid second skin. During the nights, the temperature would plummet, and the moisture on the roof would turn into a treacherous glaze of ice. He slept in fits and starts, huddled against the chimneys for a ghost of warmth, listening to the hum of the prison beneath him. But he was not as alone as the authorities hoped. In a remarkable display of solidarity, the other inmates, men who usually reserved a special kind of loathing for those accused of harming children, began to help. They saw his resolve. They heard his unwavering cry of innocence. Using lengths of twine and makeshift fishing hooks, they would spirit food and supplies up to the heights. Hot tea in plastic containers, wrapped in thick cloth to preserve the heat, would swing precariously through the air until Michael's frost-nipped fingers could pull them in. It was a lifeline of human kindness, in a place designed to strip it away. Below the high perimeter walls, another figure stood in constant, flickering light. Anne Welland, Michael's mother, became a fixture of the landscape. She was there in the early morning light and in the dead of the freezing night, her breath visible in the air like a series of small, white prayers. She would look up at the tiny speck of her son on the horizon and shout words of encouragement that the wind would often snatch away. She brought the eyes of the media with her. The cameras began to linger on the prison gates, and the newspapers began to ask questions that had been silenced years before. Investigative journalists, including the relentless Paul Foote, started to pull at the loose threads of the original trial. They looked at the lack of forensic evidence and the suspicious nature of the confessions. The public, who had once been so certain of the guilt of the four men, began to feel a shift in the air. The image of a 21-year-old man shivering on a rooftop for 3 months just to be heard was more powerful than any legal brief. It was a visual testament to a desperation that only the truth can produce. By February, the protest had reached a breaking point. Michael's body was failing him. The skin on his hands and feet had turned a worrying shade of blue and black, the unmistakable signature of frostbite. The 89 days of exposure had carved lines into his face that made him look decades older than his years. The physical pain was a constant, throbbing roar, and the mental exhaustion was a fog even thicker than the Leicestershire mist. On the 21st of February, 1984, the end came not through force, but through a mother's plea. Anne Welland stood near the walls and begged her son to come down before the winter claimed his life entirely. She promised him that the world was finally watching, that his message had been received, and that the fight would move from the rooftops to the courtrooms. When Michael finally began his descent, his movements were stiff and agonizingly slow. He did not come down as a defeated man, but as a catalyst. As he was led away to the prison infirmary, the silence that returned to the rooftop was a different kind of silence than before. It was no longer the silence of a closed case, but the heavy, expectant silence of a truth that was finally beginning to breathe. The skin on Michael's feet had turned a bruised, ghostly shade of blue, a silent testament to the oxygen fleeing his system as the hunger strike ground onward. But while he lay in the sterile, airless quiet of the prison infirmary, his mother, Anne Wellan, was becoming a storm of quiet and focused energy. She sat at her small kitchen table in the Midlands, a space once reserved for morning tea and family chatter, now transformed into a command center overflowing with the weight of injustice. The air in the room was often heavy with the scent of stale tea and the metallic tang of the fountain pen she used to write hundreds of letters. Each stroke of her pen was a deliberate act of defiance against a system that had closed its doors. She looked at the stacks of manila folders, their edges frayed and yellowed like old teeth, containing the transcripts of a trial that she knew, with every fiber of her being, was a hollow fiction. The light from a single overhead bulb cast long, flickering shadows across the linoleum floor, mimicking the uncertainty of the years that had already slipped through her fingers. She was not a lawyer or a detective, but she possessed the terrifying clarity of a mother who knew her son was a thief, perhaps, but never a killer. Her hands, though tired, never trembled as she sorted through the names of witnesses who had seen things the police had asked them to forget. She was trudging through a landscape of silence, knocking on doors that remained bolted, and speaking to a world that had already decided her son was a monster. The silence of the night was her only companion, a thick and velvety quiet that she filled with the scratching of her pen and the soft, rhythmic rustle of paper. In the bustling, smoke-filled newsroom of the Daily Mirror, a man named Paul Foote received one of those letters in 1980. The atmosphere there was a frantic tapestry of clacking typewriters, the sharp scent of hot lead, and the constant, low-frequency roar of a world in motion. Paul was a man of sharp intellect and a restless conscience, a journalist who hunted for the cracks in the facade of British justice. Initially, he had looked at the case of the paperboy and seen what everyone else saw: a unanimous jury, a signed confession, and a group of men already known to the law. He had sent Anne what he later called a push-off letter, a polite dismissal wrapped in the professional courtesy of a busy man. But Anne Wellan did not accept dismissals. She sent him more. She sent him documents from the Director of Public Prosecutions, papers that felt cold and heavy in his hands. As Paul sat in his office, the walls lined with the ghosts of previous investigations, he began to notice the inconsistencies that Anne had highlighted with her steady, unwavering hand. He saw the name of another man, an ambulance driver named Hubert Spencer, who had been a suspect long before the four men were ever pulled into a precinct. Paul felt the first stirrings of a deep, unsettled curiosity, a sensation like a cold breeze moving through a locked room. He realized that the narrative the public had swallowed was not a solid structure, but a house of cards held together by the glue of a single, questionable confession. He decided to meet her, stepping out of the frantic rhythm of Fleet Street and into the quiet, desperate reality of a mother's crusade. Together, they began to pull at the loose threads of the prosecution's tapestry. They focused on a detail that had been buried beneath the sensational headlines: a blue Vauxhall Viva. Witnesses near Yew Tree Farm on that terrible afternoon in 1978 had spoken of a vehicle the color of a summer twilight sitting in the driveway. It was a car that did not belong to any of the four men. They discovered that Hubert Spencer, the local ambulance driver, not only drove a car of that exact description, but also wore a uniform that matched the descriptions given by those who had seen a man at the farm. Paul and Anne walked the lanes around the isolated farmhouse, the damp Staffordshire air clinging to their coats like a physical weight. They stood in the very spots where witnesses had claimed to see the killers, realizing that from those vantage points, the details were blurred and uncertain, yet the police had treated them as absolute truths. The shadow of Hubert Spencer loomed larger when they learned that, only a year after the four were sentenced, he had murdered a friend at a neighboring farm in a manner that bore a chilling resemblance to the death of young Carl. The victim had been sitting on a sofa, just as the boy had been. The police had dismissed this as a tragic coincidence, but to Anne and Paul, it felt like a scream in a silent cathedral. They spoke to an ambulance station secretary who had provided Spencer with a cast-iron alibi, only to find that her memory was as porous as old stone. The realization that the real killer might still be walking the very lanes they were treading sent a shiver through the narrative, a cold current of truth beginning to melt the ice of the official story. The heart of the injustice, however, lay in a series of interrogation rooms where the air was thick with pressure and the smell of fear. Patrick Mawley, a man of fragile nerves and failing health, had provided the confession that anchored the entire case. But as Paul Foote delved deeper, he found evidence of a systematic breaking of a human spirit. Mawley had been held in isolation, denied the comfort of family or the guidance of a lawyer, and subjected to a relentless cycle of questioning that blurred the lines between reality and fabrication. The police had used a tactic as old as time. They showed him a statement they claimed had been signed by Vincent Hickey, a document that placed the blame squarely on Mawley's shoulders. It was a lie. Years later, a specialized process called electrostatic document analysis would reveal the terrifying truth hidden in the fibers of the paper. This test, which could detect the invisible indentations of writing from pages above, proved that the police had fabricated the very signature used to trick Mawley into his own admission. They had created a ghost statement, a forgery designed to shatter the resolve of a man who was already falling apart. In the dark, cramped cells of the prison, Mawley had signed his own doom, a signature written in the ink of desperation. He died of a heart attack in 1981, still behind bars, his final breaths carrying the weight of a truth no one wanted to hear. Anne and Paul held these findings like precious, fragile glass. The kernel of the prosecution's case was not a confession at all, but a manufactured echo, a lie that had been polished until it looked like justice. The path was long, and the resistance from the Home Office was a wall of cold, gray stone. Each time Anne and Paul presented their findings, they were met with a bureaucratic silence that felt like a personal insult to the boy who had died and the men who were rotting in his name. Anne would return from visits to Michael, her heart heavy with the sight of his thinning frame and his hollow eyes, only to sit back down at that kitchen table and start again. She became a familiar figure in the corridors of power, a woman in a sensible coat who carried the truth in a plastic shopping bag. She wasn't asking for mercy, she was demanding a reckoning. Investigative journalist Paul Foote published his findings in a book titled Murder at the Farm in 1986, a volume that peeled back the layers of the investigation to reveal the rot beneath. The public began to listen, the once unanimous condemnation of the four men beginning to splinter under the weight of the evidence. They had uncovered suppressed statements, ignored witnesses, and the technical proof of police malpractice. The timeline the police had constructed was revealed to be a fiction, a narrative shaped to fit the suspects they had chosen rather than the facts they had found. The unyielding path Anne Welland trod was paved with the thousands of letters she had written and the miles she had traveled, a mother's love acting as a steady flame in a long, dark tunnel. She knew that the truth was not something that simply emerged. It had to be dragged into the light, inch by grueling inch. The battle was far from over, but the silence that had once protected the guilty was finally beginning to crack, and the echoes of a paperboy's interrupted route were growing louder in the halls of the High Court. The air inside the Royal Courts of Justice in London on that day in February 1997 was thick with the scent of old paper and polished mahogany. It was a heavy, expectant air that seemed to press against the lungs of everyone waiting in the gallery. For 18 years, The story of the four men had been a series of closed doors and iron bars. But today, the very structure of the building felt as though it were breathing. You could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance, a sound that underscored the nearly 2 decades that had slipped away like sand through fingers. The light that filtered through the high, arched windows was pale and gray, typical of a British winter, illuminating the tiny motes of dust that danced in the stillness. When the 3 appeal judges finally took their seats, the rustle of their robes was the only sound in a room that had become a vacuum of silence. This was the moment that Anne Wellan and the legal teams had fought for through 8 separate inquiries and years of bitter resistance from the Home Office. The tension was a physical cord, stretched tight and vibrating, as the ruling began to unfold, word by careful word, peeling back the layers of a conviction that had been built on a foundation of sand. The judges spoke of the electrostatic document analysis, a scientific process that had peered into the past and revealed the invisible indentations of a lie. They described how the police had fabricated evidence, creating a false confession to trick a man into admitting to a crime he did not commit. But as the words, convictions quashed, finally echoed through the hall, a profound and hollow sadness settled alongside the joy. One man was not there to hear his name cleared. Patrick Molley had passed away in the cold, sterile confines of a prison cell in June of 1981, just 2 years into his 12-year sentence for manslaughter. Imagine the silence of that cell in the moments before his heart failed. The smell of floor wax and thin, industrial blankets. Patrick had spent his final days insisting that his confession had been beaten and coerced out of him, a voice crying out in a wilderness of steel and stone. He died with the weight of a murder on his shoulders, a weight that the law was only now admitting it had placed there in error. His absence in the courtroom was a ghost that sat between the surviving men, a reminder that while the law can correct its records, it can never restore the breath to a man who died in the shadow of an injustice. When James Robinson, Michael Hickey, and Vincent Hickey finally walked out into the London afternoon, the world was a different place than the one they had left behind in 1978. The air was sharp and cold, biting at their skin, which had grown pale under the fluorescent hum of prison corridors. They were surrounded by a sea of flashing cameras and shouting voices, but for a moment, everything must have felt profoundly quiet. Think of the texture of a wool coat against a palm that has touched only cold brick for 18 years. Think of the way the streetlights began to flicker on, casting long, orange glows across the wet pavement. Michael Hickey had spent 89 days on a prison roof in the freezing winter of 1983 to protest his innocence, a lonely figure against the sky. Now, his feet were on level ground, but the psychological scars were deep and jagged. The victory was sweet, yet it was laced with the bitterness of the time stolen. The birthdays missed, the quiet mornings lost, the simple rhythm of a life that had been interrupted and then shattered. They were free men, but they were men who carried the heavy, invisible luggage of nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment. While the men found their way back into the world, Yew Tree Farm remained as it always was, tucked away in the Staffordshire countryside near Stourbridge. The farm is a place where time seems to pool and stagnate, a landscape of damp earth and rust. If you were to stand there now, you would hear the wind whispering through the dark, waxy needles of the yew trees that give the house its name. It is a lonely sound, like the rustle of a silk ribbon caught in a bramble. The farmhouse itself, where young Carl Bridgewater arrived on his bicycle on that September afternoon in 1978, holds its secrets behind thick walls and silent windows. You can almost see the ghost of that blue car, the one the witnesses described, idling in the driveway, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum against the chirping of the birds. The smell of wood smoke and wet grass lingers in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of an old, rusted gate that groans on its hinges. It is a place of profound stillness, Yet it is a stillness that feels heavy, as though the ground itself remembers the sound of a single gunshot that changed everything. The farmhouse stands as a monument to a mystery that has never been solved, a quiet witness to a tragedy that left a permanent stain on the soil. The files on the murder of Carl Bridgewater remain open, yet they are gathered under the settling dust of decades. No one else has ever been charged. The shadow of suspicion occasionally falls upon others, names whispered in the dark, men who lived and breathed in the same circles of crime as the original four. People speak of Bert Spencer, the man who lived nearby and who later committed a strikingly similar crime at Holloway Farm, but the evidence remains a tangled web of what-ifs and might-have-beens. The bicycle Carl rode, the newspapers he carried, the fingerprints that didn't match any of the men in the dock, these pieces of the puzzle remain scattered on the floor of history. There is a specific kind of grief in an unsolved crime. It is a wound that never quite scabs over because there is no final period at the end of the sentence. The echo of that afternoon in 1978 continues to ripple outward, a quiet, mournful note that hangs over the fields and the lanes of the West Midlands. It is a reminder that sometimes the truth is a shy thing, retreating further into the shadows the more we reach for it. We are left with the image of a young boy on a bicycle, a life of 13 years frozen in the golden light of an autumn evening, forever arriving at a door that leads into a mystery we cannot unravel. As you lie there now, let the image of the farm fade. The wind through the yew trees is becoming a soft, distant hum, no louder than the sound of your own breathing. The courtroom, the prison bars, the long, gray roads of Staffordshire, they are all receding into the mist. The weight of the world, with all its unanswered questions and its long searches for justice, is shifting away from you. You are here, in the safety of the present moment, surrounded by the softness of your blankets and the gentle rhythm of the night. There is nothing more to solve tonight. The stories have been told, and the voices have grown quiet. The world is settling into its evening rest, and you may settle with it. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders, flowing out like a receding tide. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.